The panelists will kindly turn their video cameras on. We extend a warm welcome to our audience. This is the US Medra user group virtual meeting, so a sign of our pandemic times. Normally we have face-to-face meetings to coincide with the DIA meeting in the US, but we're fortunate in a way to be able to extend our communications to the wider user community around the world. I think we have about 300 people registered. So in a high degree of interest in the topics that we'll be presenting today. Just like to start with some logistical aspects. If we could go to the next slide, please, Hannah. Thank you. So my colleague Hannah Eaton will be providing technical support. We do like these sessions to be interactive and welcome your questions. You can submit them during the presentations by going to the control panel on the right-hand part of your screen. You'll see a drop-down for a question box. So simply type your question into the box and then click send. We will pause at the end of each individual presentation to take your questions. And my colleague Nicole, who's also facilitating the meeting, will actually copy and paste the question to be addressed into the chat pane. So all attendees will be able to look at the chat pane, which is just below the question pane, to see all of these questions that are being submitted. I suggest that as we advance through the presentations, you might want to think of your question and submit it while the presentation is ongoing, so that we'll be teed up with questions at the end of each presentation. Now, we've got a busy agenda and maybe due to time constraints, we can't get to everybody's questions, so I apologize for that in advance, but we'll do our very best to do that. Next slide, please. So you will be able to get a copy of the slides. In fact, Hannah has already put those in the handouts pane. There are the set of 5 PDFs there, which contain all of the slides from these presentations. And they're also posted on the user group section. The address there is at the bottom of the page. And also there you will find a day or two after this webinar, a recording that you can stream or download for yourself to view at a later time or share with your colleagues. So next slide, please. So we have a full agenda today. I'll be starting off with the customary Medra update, and then I'll be transitioning to our distinguished panel of speakers that will be addressing various topical Medra topics. Of great interest, I think, to all of us in the pandemic is how the safety of COVID-19 vaccines are monitored by the FDA and the CDC in the Vares adverse event reporting system. Then I'll transition to Kate, who will be talking about the Snomed CT Medra mappings and how these are actually applied in a practical use case at MHRA. And then some very practical presentations from Hank and Lee on the topic of Medra versioning and how to apply the Medra version analysis tool, Mvat, to good advantage. And then we'll wrap up with an open Q&A session for any of your questions. So let's meet our presenters. My name is Judy Harrison. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of the Medra Msso, and I'm located in Greenville, South Carolina in the US. Next, please. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Narayan Nair from the FDA. He is the Director of the Division of Epidemiology, and this division oversees pharmacovigilance activities for vaccines and other biologics at the FDA. He served on several FDA advisory committees related to vaccines. Joining him for the Q&A session will also be David Menschik, who's the Associate Director for Surveillance Informatics in the Division of Epidemiology as well. He served at FDA in a variety of positions over 15 years in both the pre-marketing and post-marketing arenas. And on to Kate. So Kate is a Pharmacovigilance Information Coordinator at MHRA in the UK. She's been intimately involved with the pharmacovigilance activities there and is now extending those efforts into using the Snomed CT Medra maps that we've recently made available to the user community. And then last but not least, Hank Dennis. He's a Senior Manager of Clinical Data Coding at CGen. If you've been in the US user group meetings, you'll have surely bumped into Hank. He's been working with this community over many years. He has over 22 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry in coding and data management. And we're delighted to welcome Dr. Li Zhang, who is an Associate Medical Safety Director at Roche. Prior to Roche, she actually worked at the NIH in Bethesda in the US, where she was a research fellow. And I'll have to note for you that Li is showing extreme dedication to Medra. She is actually located in Beijing, China, where it is 1 o'clock in the morning. So we really thank you, Li, for making the effort to share your expertise with our Medra community. It really is a global community. So we've introduced ourselves to you. Now we'd like to hear a little bit about yourselves, and Hannah should have some polling questions that you can just answer by clicking on your screen. So we'll just tee those up. Okay, since we're not restricted to a physical location in the US, could you tell us where you're attending from? Okay, and the poll has closed. And we're seeing majority from North America, Latin America and the Caribbean and Europe. But Li, you're the only person on the Asian time zone. But we will be recording this webinar, as I said, so our colleagues in Asia or Africa have the opportunity to review it at a later stage. So nice global spread there. And next one, please. And what type of organization do you work for? Okay, so fairly typical for these webinars, a lot of people from pharma companies, smattering of device organizations, good representation from CROs, and it's always good to see regulatory authorities as well. And what is your role or position? Okay, so again, a fairly typical spread, majority are coders, but good representation from drug safety or pharmacovigilance. We're seeing increasing representation from those areas at our webinars, so that's good to know. Also interesting from the informatics side, represented as well. And this is a bit of a crystal ball question, and the answers might be very different now with the emergence of the Delta variant. How soon should the MSO be resuming face-to-face training in your region? Presently, we're only doing face-to-face in China, but if you're in North America or Europe, do you have a gut feel about when the MSO should be scheduling face-to-face training classes? Yeah, no surprise there. I think I'm not sure either. Possibly early next year, I think that would be realistic, but we will carefully evaluate based on the changing situation globally, make sure that our trainers and our attendees are safe for the resumption of face-to-face training. So last question on a related topic. If and when we do start face-to-face training, would you be willing to attend? Are you ready to jump back into it right away when it's safe? Or has the pandemic changed your focus and are you more happy to receive training in a virtual format? Okay, good. So fairly even split there. It's hard to predict, but I think a lot of us do appreciate seeing each other face to face and would like to do that, not rely exclusively on the virtual format. Great, well, thank you very much for that information. If Hannah, you could switch over to my Medra update, and I'll get going. And to avoid distractions, we're going to turn our cameras off for now, but I'll come back on when I take questions at the end. So Hank, if you could just turn off your camera, that's perfect. Okay, well, welcome again. I'd like to provide an update on some of our Medra and Msso activities. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see I've got a number of topics to address. First two are related to maps. I'll talk about the Snomed Medra maps as a background to Kate's presentation. I've got a couple of topics to tell you about with regard to Medra translations. And then three new things, a new SMQ, new MSSO staff, and new training offerings for you. So if we go into the Snomed CT Medra maps, a little bit of background for you. The first production release of these maps was on the 30th of April. It was a collaboration between Snomed International, which owns Snomed CT terminology, and ICH, which owns Medra. Next slide. These maps, as Kate will describe, were developed under the auspices of the Web Radar 2 project. And in the pursuance of terminology interoperability, we developed two maps, independent maps, from Medra to Snomed CT and Snomed CT to Medra. Now, these don't represent all of Medra or all of Snomed. They were focused on the most frequently reported pharmacovigilance terms from Vigilance and MHRA databases. You'll see that the total size of the Medra to Snomed CT map is larger than in the reverse direction. And that's because we are mapping at the Medra LLT level. In the first three rows of that spreadsheet there, you'll see three different ways in Medra we express at the LLT level the concept of abdominal aortic aneurysm. The maps were actually constructed to Snomed CT at their fully specified name level, which is equivalent to a PT, it's a single medical concept. So in Medra, while we might have three different ways of expressing that concept, it only goes to one Snomed CT term. So it's larger on the Medra side than the Snomed CT side. But then coming back in the other direction from Snomed CT, that one term, the FSN, abdominal aortic aneurysm, just maps to the exact match LLT and Medra, so it's smaller. Other things contributing to the differences in size is that in Medra, at the LLT level, we have both UK and US spellings, and you'll actually see that in Kate's presentation. So these are the maps that are distributed on our Medra website that I will show you. The identical maps are also distributed by our partner organization, Snomed International. It's a different format. It's a HTML format that they distribute through their national distribution service to the Snomed CT subscribers. But for Medra subscribers, this is what the maps will look like, a simple spreadsheet format. We may change the format in the future, but for now, this seems to be simple and easy for everyone to use. And next, please. And here's where you access the maps on the Medra website. So you have to be a Medra subscriber to be able to access them. So this is the downloads page where you can access all of the Medra files, but also the map files. And you'll see the April 2021 first release package that contains the spreadsheet of those two maps and also the mapping release notes. Next, please. There's quite a lot of supporting documentation and tools that go with the maps as well to help users. We've got a dedicated mapping page on our website under the Tools section. And in that right-hand kiosk there, you'll see some relevant documentation. At the bottom, I'd point out the Medra Snomed CT mapping conventions. These help users understand how the maps were developed and the particular set of conventions and rules that we had for developing them. So it'll understand how, for example, we took those 3 Medra terms and mapped it to a single Snomed CT term. So we do encourage users of the maps to read and understand those before applying them. I'll come on to talk about the MapCR application because it wasn't just about the development of the maps, but it's important for both organizations jointly to be able to continue to maintain and develop them for the benefit of users. So we have an application to take change requests for the maps. We have a set of use instructions for this tool, although it's fairly intuitive to read, and also criteria for accepting change requests. So let's go to the next slide to see how that is done. So we've created a free online change request tool. If you've used our own WebCR tool for Medra, it'll look very familiar to you. But this allows both Medra subscribers and Snomed CT subscribers to be able to submit change requests for adding terms to be mapped in either direction, either from Medra to Snomed or starting in Snomed and then back again. Or if you see a map that you think is incorrect, you can submit changes to the maps. You can also search submitted change requests. So if a term has already been submitted by another user, we can give you an alert to say this mapping is already in process, so there's no need for you to submit that. It's very, again, similar to the functionality of our WebCR change request tool. So it represents an ongoing maintenance and development of these maps. The current release schedule is once a year in April, but we will possibly be making interim maps available on a supplemental basis once they are preliminarily mapped, so that users have the ability to start using that map at their own risk before the next official release. And finally, next slide. I've just really touched the surface of the maps and their use cases. Those are described in more detail in a recent webinar by my colleague, Dr. Amanda Sanders, and that's available on the training materials page on the Medra website, or you can view it on the MSSO's YouTube channel. So more to come on that, and Kate will be talking about a very relevant use case in her organization. Next, please. And also on the topic of mappings, we're pleased to announce that the Medra Management Committee has supported the MSSO to pursue the development and maintenance of an ICD-10 to mapping, the Medra mapping, in collaboration with WHO. I think there's strong use cases for an ICD-10 mapping. I know many of your organizations might have tried to develop your own in the past, but it'd be good to have a standardized mapping developed by both organizations for users. There's a lot of ICD-10 coded data in places like patient registries, patient health records, claims databases that could be mined and extracted terms to convert to Medra for the purposes of regulatory reporting or tracking patient outcomes, for example. And looking ahead, the Medra Management Committee has also supported our exploration with WHO to develop and maintain mappings between ICD-11 and Medra. And those will probably be bidirectional mappings in the same way that we have with Snomed and Medra. So just early on in the process, but we're encouraged to be able to move forward with this important work. We'll have more details regarding the timelines, the formats, the distribution of the maps when we have that available. We'll communicate that to you. And next, please. Okay, 2 translation topics. So the Medra Management Committee has approved a very ambitious program of additional translations of Medra. Currently this year, we're working on Greek, Latvian, Maltese, Polish, and Swedish. And you're probably wondering where all these requests are coming from. There's actually a European initiative to provide electronic prescribing information, both for healthcare professionals and for patients, in an electronic format in all of the supported languages in the European Economic Area. So there's potentially a total of 17 additional languages, including those 5 that you see on the screen, that we will be developing over the next few years. In the more recent horizon as well, we have approval from the Medra Management Committee to do an Arabic translation. So I think that's filling a big gap to provide users in the Arabic-speaking countries with a full documentation and translation of Medra. So if all of these go ahead, in a few years we will have 32 translations of Medra, really reflecting our global reach. And the next translation topic is the Russian translation of the full PTC document. So that's the full term selection and data retrieval presentation. The Medra Management Committee supported us doing this because we really have a need, and we have strict criteria for when we do this. First of all, we have to have a native native Russian speaker on staff, and I will be introducing you to Dr. Obenihina very shortly. She provides support for us in Russia. Already she's starting doing training courses, answering help desk questions that can only really be addressed adequately by reference to the full points to consider documents. We also have the support of the Russian Regulatory Authority. They wish to have this available in Russian to support users in the Russian-speaking countries. And also the Russian Federation itself is actually in the top 10 of countries or regions that are growing most rapidly with respect to Medra subscribers. So clearly a full need to have these translations available. So over the course of this year, Yelena will be working with the Russian regulator to produce those full translations, and that will then bring up the total number of translations that we have available, again, all supported by native speaking staff on the MSSO in Chinese, English, Japanese, Korean, and Spanish. And you can see the Spanish documents there available on the support documentation page of our website. And next, please. 3 new topics. We've got a new SMQ coming for sexual dysfunction. So this represents a set of concepts that are important in class labeling for a number of different products around the world, for antidepressants or contraceptives, finasteride and levodopa. Now, since this condition is pretty well established, we know what types of concepts or terms would be represented. The MSSO actually developed this SMQ in a fairly rapid fashion, using international regulatory and industry experts to provide their feedback. So we based the documentation and the term list solely on medical judgment. Didn't have any need to go and test the actual terms on databases, because effectively the terms we know represent this condition have already been validated by their inclusion in class labeling. So we were able to develop a nice, neat little SMQ, narrow and broad search terms, and a total of 97 PTs. We've just sent off the documentation to the Medra Management Committee for their approval, and hopefully they will approve that as is, and then we'll be able to go into production with this SMQ in version 24.1 in September 2021. And next, new MSSO staff. As I mentioned, Dr. Yelena Obenihina joined us earlier this year. She's based in Moscow, Russia, and she will be responsible not only for providing the ongoing local support and training to Russian speakers, but she'll be working on the translation of the full PTC documents. Yelena has a lot of experience with Medra. In fact, she led the Russian translation team that developed the Russian translation of Medra a couple of years ago, that's now in production. And assisting me on this webinar is Nicole Fornarato. She's joined us recently to work on mapping initiatives, both Snomed CT and ICD, and she will also be conducting US-based training. Most recently, she was an Associate Director of Medical Coding at Celgene, and she's based in New Jersey. So welcome to our new staff. And lastly, new training offerings. So on the left-hand side, you see our stalwart face-to-face classes, Coding with Medra and Safety Data Analysis, SMQs. The only place where we're actually conducting face-to-face training right now is in China. You'll see with respect to the webinars and the instructional videos, those are highlighted in green, a completely new courses added since the end of last year. So the pandemic has forced us to shift in the way that we deliver training. A couple of them in blue there, Getting Started with Medra, and the Snomed CT Medra mapping webinars were open to both Medra subscribers like yourselves, as well as non-subscribers. Particularly for the Getting Started with Medra, there was a lot of new subscribers or potential subscribers in Latin America. So we wanted to make that available to people who had not yet started with Medra, but were considering starting and subscribing. So it was open to all. Similarly, there was interest from the Snomed CT user community in attending our Medra Snomed CT mapping webinar, so that was open as well. We've also got a set of comprehensive how-to instructional videos, such as downloading Medra, getting a subscription, submitting a change request. There's also a very interesting interactive Medra coding class where you can practice your coding skills in an interactive format. And lastly, of course, all of our webinars are recorded on the Msso YouTube channel. And last slide. Yeah, almost last slide. So how do you navigate around all of those various training offerings? Well, we put together this roadmap to successful use of Medra. So whether you're getting ready or just want to master the basics, go on to more advanced Medra coding, or data retrieval and analysis, we've got a variety of different levels of courses and different formats for your consideration. And lastly, in response to popular request, we're working on getting an automated system together to provide training webinar attendance certificates. We've heard from users that it's very important for them, if you're expending the time to learn about Medra in a webinar format, that you should be able to get a certificate of attendance to be able to show your company that you are mastering your Medra skills. So we're still in process with the logistics of this, but to qualify for a certificate, attendees would be required to attend a minimum of 75% of the webinar duration. So you can't just log on and log off and get a certificate, but you'd need to get engaged with the material. These certificates would not be available for informational webinars such as this one. It's more directed towards our traditional training webinars. Okay, with that, I think that's the end of my presentation, Hannah, and I'd be happy to take any questions that are coming through. Nicole, do we have any questions coming through in the chat?
No questions yet.
No questions?
That I can see, no.
Okay. Well, good, that gives me an extra 2 minutes to devote to somebody else. So if we could key up Narayan and David for the next presentation. And thank you for your interest. I will be happy to take any further questions at the conclusion of this webinar in the open Q&A session. So over to Narayan. Thank you.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well, thank you.
Great. And thank you so much for this invitation and opportunity to speak. I'll be discussing the monitoring the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines. I'm the Division Director of the Division of Epidemiology in the Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. My colleague, Dr. David Menchek, is joining me and will be available to answer questions. He's our Associate Director for Surveillance Informatics. Next slide, please. This is my disclaimer, and these comments are informal communication. Next slide, please. And this is an outline of my talk. I'll be providing an overview of COVID-19 vaccine monitoring, discussing the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or VAERS. I'll discuss Medra coding in VAERS, analysis and signal detection, and I'll briefly touch on other surveillance systems. And then lastly, I'll conclude with a couple of sort of real world examples. Next slide, please. So I wanted to provide some context, and the FDA is broken down into centers. I work in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, and this is our organization chart. Our director is Dr. Marks. As I mentioned, I'm located in the Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology under Director Dr. Steve Anderson. In the Division of Epidemiology, and our charge is to monitor the post-marketing safety of biologic products. That includes vaccines and other cell therapies and a wide array of different biologic products that are regulated by FDA. But as you can see, there's other offices that are heavily involved in the licensure and approval of various products. Next slide, please. And this slide sort of emphasizes that the safety and the life cycle of FDA-regulated products, and the key concept is that throughout this life cycle, safety is addressed and monitored closely. So in the preclinical, before these products are administered to people, the safety and biological activity is assessed. In phase 1 clinical trials, these are administered under close monitoring to small numbers of individuals, and safety and dosage is assessed. Phase 2, somewhat larger clinical trial populations and safety and efficacy are evaluated. And phase 3 are these large-scale clinical trials where, again, safety and efficacy are closely monitored. And if all goes well, the product is approved, the vaccine or biologic product is approved and licensed. But the story doesn't end there. Under the post-marketing phase, you'll see that there's heavy safety surveillance as well. And all of this information feeds into safety concerns and again, helps us develop strategies and actions to minimize risk. The underlying concept here is we want to maximize the benefit and minimize the risk for all these products. Next slide, please. So, just to emphasize, FDA ensures that vaccines are safe for their intended use throughout the life cycle. Preclinical and non-human testing of candidate vaccines in the early phase human studies to the large clinical trials in phase 3. There's inspection of manufacturing facilities. There's monitoring of lot release. There's this post-marketing adverse event surveillance. And again, there's inspection of clinical sites to ensure that there's compliance with good clinical practices. So I'm going to mainly be focusing on this post-marketing adverse event surveillance, but really that's a sliver of the safety monitoring. And monitoring safety is equally important during the development and during the post-marketing period. Next slide, please. So with regard to the COVID-19 vaccine safety monitoring, as of June 17th, there had been 311 million doses administered. And there's been this large U.S. government agency effort to monitor the safety and effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccines in the post-authorization setting. And there's multiple government agencies involved in this. I'm going to speak mainly about FDA and CDC's efforts, but also there's the Center for Medicare Services, there's the Veterans Administration, there's Department of Defense, there's Indian Health Service, and National Institute of Health. All of these government agencies have vaccine safety, COVID-19 vaccine safety monitoring efforts in place. And in addition to the government efforts, there's also the manufacturers that conduct post-authorization safety effectiveness and monitoring activities. Next slide, please. So with COVID-19 vaccine safety monitoring, the post-marketing safety review includes a manual review by our medical officers of individual serious reports that are submitted to VAERS. At times, we do a case series analysis We also do aggregate data analysis, including disproportionality analyses for vaccine adverse event pairs. And we also review data from other sources, published literature, and post-marketing studies. In addition to this passive surveillance that I've described with Vares, there's active surveillance, and these post-marketing studies play a key role in evaluating and further characterizing the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch now upon Vares and passive surveillance. And the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, Vares, was established by this piece of legislation, the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act in 1986. It's co-managed by FDA and CDC. And prior to 2020, we typically get between 40 to 60,000 adverse event reports submitted annually. And about 20% of these reports met the regulatory definition of serious. For 2021, Vares has received over 400,000 reports for COVID-19 vaccines alone. So this, this illustrates that there's been very robust post-marketing safety reporting with the COVID-19 vaccines. Next slide, please. And here's a screenshot for those of you that aren't familiar with Vares. Here's a screenshot. In addition, I'll touch on this a little later. There's a site called CDC Wonder where the Vares data is made publicly available, redacted Vares data, and it's linked to in the Vares webpage as well. Next slide. This is what a Vares form looks like, and you can see that there's several boxes that the individual filling out the report can submit. Next slide, please. And so in terms of an adverse event following immunization, we think of the vaccine and then the adverse reaction or adverse effect, which could be coincidental and not related to the vaccine, or could be true. And then in between is this onset interval. And then later downstream, a report is submitted to Vares. And this is sort of a schematic from a textbook that illustrates the process. Next slide, please. So again, to further delve into this process, healthcare professionals, patients or caregivers, vaccine manufacturers, and others can submit a report to Vares. The report is processed. Medra coding takes place. There's data entry. There's quality control. In some cases, there's an effort to obtain follow-up health records. And the data is transmitted to both CDC and FDA. Some of the data is downloaded and posted. I mentioned the CDC Wonder, and the sensitive patient information is, of course, removed, and then it is downloaded to Wonder for the public to access. Next slide, please. And this is a screenshot of Wonder. This is this website is run by CDC, so I don't have a lot of detail about it, but I did want to just show the screenshot, and you can search by symptom or diagnosis or by vaccine product. And if you click on this website at the bottom of this slide, and I believe the slides are made available, it'll link to Wonder, and they have a nice sort of training and orientation to how to use this system, including a video. Next slide, please. So, how did we handle the adverse event reporting with the COVID-19 vaccines? As I'm sure everyone's aware, in the United States, they've been authorized under the emergency use authorization. And so when they were authorized, we did put certain requirements in for reporting. So for vaccine recipients, it's voluntary, and they could submit spontaneous reports to Vares, but also there's a program called VSafe that we can receive solicited reports. For healthcare providers, and vaccine administrators, there is mandatory reporting, and that includes serious adverse events, cases of COVID-19 that result in hospitalization or death, vaccine administration errors, regardless of whether they're associated with an adverse event, and two conditions, multi-inflammatory system disease in children or adults. Vaccine manufacturers also have similar mandatory reporting requirements, and in addition, are required to submit periodic safety reports. These are our monthly submissions and are a summary overview of the applicant's safety findings over that previous month, and includes cumulative observations with respect to the mandatory reporting categories. All of this is submitted to Vares. CDC and FDA have complementary roles in assessing the safety of the vaccine, CDC reviews all the adverse events of special interest and does data abstraction, among other things. Here at FDA, we screen the adverse events regardless of severity. We screen all incoming serious adverse events. We perform literature reviews, data mining, and of course, potential safety signals are evaluated further. So there's close coordination and data sharing between these two government agencies. Next slide, please. So the strengths of the VAERS are it is open-ended, and allows for hypothesis generation. It can allow us to detect these new rare adverse events. There's geographic diversity. We have this capability to monitor production lots. It's very timely. We can obtain data fairly quickly, and it's not limited by geographic area. We can capture reports from the entire U.S. population. Limitations include with any passive surveillance, there could be missing inaccurate data. We aren't able to report, verify the reported diagnoses. There could be underreporting, and in many cases, we have an absence of denominators. Now, I have to say with COVID-19, we have very strong data related to dosage administration. So the absence of denominators is less a factor than it is with other vaccines. As a converse to underreporting, we could have a reporting bias or stimulated reporting. If a particular adverse event or safety issue is brought up in the media, we may see sort of a number of reports submitted to VAERS in a stimulated reporting fashion. Of course, there is an absence of unvaccinated control groups, and so there's an inability to assess causation based solely on VAERS. The longer the latency period is between any particular adverse event, the lower the likelihood it'll be detected in VAERS. Next slide, please. So in terms of using the Medra to code the VAERS reports, the VAERS reports can be received online, mail, fax, or by phone, and I showed that form in a previous slide. There's data in about 28 boxes. 8 of these are required for the report to be submitted. And VAERS medical coders use Medra to code text in these VAERS report boxes. The coders use the Medra search tool to identify the best matching Medra LLT codes to report, and the PTs are automatically assigned for chosen LLTs. The tool uses the most recent Medra version available. Next slide, please. I'm now going to move on to signal evaluation and risk management. So I've sort of talked about sort of the input and the data we receive from VAERS and how that's processed. Now I'll shift and talk about kind of what we do with that. Next slide. So in terms of signal evaluation, in our center, the medical officers and epidemiologists review the individual serious adverse reports found in VAERS. At times, we can do a case series analysis. If we see something unexpected clinically or a demographic clustering, if we have an adverse event that we feel there's a biologic plausibility for causal association, if we see a report of a positive or re-challenge report, that may lead us to look into it further. Or if there's an absence of alternate explanations, we don't have any concurrent medications or premorbid conditions. Also, we do aggregate data analysis. I mentioned this disproportionality analysis, and we review other sources. We're always monitoring the published literature and post-marketing studies as well. Next. As we evaluate this, I wanted to sort of define what a safety signal is. It's a concern about an excess adverse events compared to what we would be expected to see with that product's use. Next slide. So, signals generally indicate the need for further evaluation, which may or may not need to lead to this conclusion that it's related to the product. After a signal is identified, it's further assessed to see whether there is a potential risk or whether any action is indicated. Next slide. And from the FDA perspective, here are some of the regulatory actions. They can include communications. We've had, quite robust communications with the COVID-19 vaccines and any potential safety issues. We can change the label, or in the case of the EUA, the fact sheets, and provide additional information to the vaccine recipients and vaccine administrators. We can do lot recalls if needed. And then there's this option for post-marketing requirements or post-marketing commitments. And basically, for requirement, it's a study that under the statute, we can ask the manufacturer to conduct a study to assess a known risk or a signal of a serious risk, or if there's something unexpected. And under a commitment, the manufacturer sort of agrees to do this. So basically, it's a lower level. Next slide, please. So this schematic sort of goes through what I've covered. You know, the pre-licensure, we have the clinical trial information. Post-licensure, we have our spontaneous reporting. We have other electronic health databases and other sources of information. All of this is really hypothesis generating for detecting a signal and to a certain extent evaluating it. But to test the hypothesis, you know, we need signal verification. And this is done through large electronic healthcare databases, observational studies, or additional post-marketing clinical trials. And all of this, you know, through this process may lead to the regulatory actions that I had mentioned previously. Next slide, please. So I wanted to touch upon some of these other surveillance systems in addition to Vares. Next slide. And so this is the safety monitoring timeline. So, you know, we see the start of vaccination, and early on, there's several programs that are available. This includes the VSafe, which is sort of this solicited adverse event reporting, passive surveillance, which is Vares, and then individual case consults. This is a program run by CDC called the Clinical Immunization Safety Assessment Product, or CISA, where healthcare providers can contact investigators working with CDC and vaccine safety experts and discuss cases. And then further sort of downstream, we have these large linked databases, including the CDC's Vaccine Safety Data Link. National Institute of Aging has a Genesis project that they're using to monitor safety in elderly for COVID-19 vaccines. The VA, as I mentioned, and Department of Defense have respective systems, and the FDA has a number of different systems in these large linked databases to monitor safety. Next slide, please. I don't really have time to do justice to all these systems, but I wanted to cover a few main concepts. I've mentioned VSafe a couple of times, and this is a CDC-run system that was established by them. It's a smartphone-based active safety monitoring where individuals who receive a vaccine can opt in, and then they get sort of these cues to report how they're doing following vaccine. And if they have a sort of a medically attended event, they do get contacted and a report is submitted to Vares. Next, we have the Biologic Effectiveness and Safety System. This is an FDA-run system that has the partners listed here, quite a few partners, and it's really a variety of healthcare settings, including inpatient, emergency department, outpatient, and the emphasis is on the electronic health records, and there's some claims data, and there's some linked claims and electronic health record data. So this allows detection of rare, vaccine adverse events, one over 50,000 or lower. And so this is more active surveillance. Next slide, please. There's an ongoing FDA and Center for Medicare Medicaid Services partnership to monitor vaccine safety. And this data covers a very large population of the elderly, 55 million U.S. beneficiaries over 65. So over 92% of U.S. elderly use the Medicare. So this database is not a sample. It really is a large proportion of the elderly population. And again, it has a wide array of healthcare settings, inpatient, outpatient. And it has claims data, and there is access to the medical charts. Next slide, please. So the monitoring goals of these U.S. government data systems, as I mentioned, earlier, Vares and the passive surveillance is sort of hypothesis generating. These systems sort of further delineate and verify a signal and allow us to evaluate it. The claims-based systems cover tens of millions of patients and can detect these rare vaccine adverse event systems. And that includes the FDA, CMS, and BEST. The electronic health records-based systems, can provide a granular clinical detail about these potential safety signals, and these include the CDC's Vaccine Safety Data Link, the VA system, and again, some additional BEST systems with these partners in particular. And so as a result of this, we have several large U.S. government safety monitoring systems that run kind of simultaneously, and they provide opportunities for cross-verification of these findings. So if there's a true finding in one system, generally it should be seen in others. And use of these multiple systems can allow verification of true signals or detection of false positives, and this triangulation approach is very helpful for verifying signals or false signals across the systems. Next slide, please. So I was going to conclude with a couple of examples. First, in terms of using Medra for adverse events of special interest, I showed the Vares form, and the adverse events are captured on box 18 of that form. And the Vares contract has a list of 18 adverse events of special interest that automatically trigger follow-up, including requesting medical records. And these adverse events of special interest were generated really based on sort of adverse events that historically we were concerned about, theoretical concerns, or something perhaps that we saw in the clinical trials that we didn't quite think was a safety issue, but we wanted to monitor closely. And so a hypothetical example is shown here. If heart attack is recorded in box 8, it'll be coded as the LLT heart attack and automatically mapped to the PT myocardial infarction. And since that PT is on the AESI list, follow-up is initiated and can lead to capturing new Medra terms. And if you want further details about this process, at the bottom of this slide, actually the standard operating procedure for Vares and how we're using it to monitor safety of the COVID vaccines can be found at this link. Next slide, please. So in our center, we use a similar Medra-defined list of AESIs to automatically identify potential reports for further review. And at routine intervals, our medical officers review the line listings with the structured and unstructured data from these reports. So Medra terms from box 18 are reviewed alongside the unstructured narrative text. And oftentimes, we have sufficient data to disposition and make a decision about how to handle that particular report. But if not, we can review the scanned source documents and we can request additional follow-up information if needed. Next slide. So I wanted to touch upon, I sort of gave one example of our process. This is another one that sort of emphasizes a safety signal that we detected, and really it started with our FDA physicians conducting this manual review of the serious adverse events. We found a cluster of blood clots in unusual locations associated with thrombocytopenia. Now, blood clots can occur in locations such as the venous system in the legs with deep venous thrombosis. But these were blood clots that were very unusual locations and associated with low platelets. So kind of an unusual constellation of symptoms. We had, and this was labeled later as thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome. And eventually there were 6 reports of TTS following the Janssen vaccine out of 6.8 million doses administered. So a reporting rate of 0.87 cases per million, but it sort of speaks to the robust safety monitoring that we were able to pick this up, even though there was a relatively few number of reports. But later, additional reports were submitted by healthcare providers, and they were submitted directly to the CDC. And reports with any PT in the standardized Medra query for this SMQ, embolic and thrombotic events, were manually reviewed to see whether they met the criteria for TTS. So for all these cases, CDC did a tremendous amount of outreach, and medical records were requested for these potential cases to confirm thrombosis with laboratory evidence of thrombocytopenia. We met with CDC and would adjudicate these cases to see what was going on. Next slide, please. And here is sort of the timeline of the Janssen COVID-19 vaccine in 2021. It was authorized February 27th. Vaccination started March 2nd. And then between March 19th and April 12th, we had these 6 cases that we found, and the records collection and investigation by FDA and CDC started. By April 13th, we had recommended a pause while we continued the investigation and gathered additional data. Between April 13th and April 23rd, there were some public meetings. Additional information was shared, and multiple communications were sent out to the public and healthcare providers to inform them of this risk, and use of the vaccine resumed and continues currently. Next slide. So, to summarize, the government has robust safety monitoring programs in place. The post-marketing surveillance, as you can see, includes many approaches, not just one. For passive surveillance, we rely on Vares, and then there's many other programs for active surveillance. But Medra plays such a key role in our safety monitoring. As you can see, there's close collaboration between FDA and CDC with these surveillance activities. Next slide. So our overall goal, of course, is to ensure the safe and effective vaccines. Next. I wanted to acknowledge my colleagues at CBER who've been working tremendously hard for all these efforts, and also my CDC colleagues. And some of these slides, they were generous enough to share and provide and allow me to show to you. Next slide. These two links from the FDA and CDC, really there's a plethora of information that can be found at both these links, and almost anything that I discussed, if you want additional detail, you can find by starting at these both these links. And thank you, and if time allows, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Narayan, for that excellent presentation. In fact, we do have a number of questions, so if we could have you and David on the line to address them. Before I just address those, I would mention for everybody on the line that a new PT for thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome will be in Medra version 24.1 in September, so allowing more accurate monitoring and reporting of those events. And also there are a couple of terms related to the presence or absence of anti-platelet factor 4 antibodies, which is a critical monitoring test that's used to confirm the diagnosis of TTS in the absence of heparin. Great. So I will address the first question. How many reports received were SAEs? And I presume this is related to slide 10, which refers to 400,000 total reports in 2021. Do you have an idea of how many were serious adverse events out of that?
Yeah, this is David. I can jump in. So off the head, I don't know the exact number, but don't hold me to this. But I remember it was about 12 to 13% the last time I looked of the COVID vaccine adverse events that were serious.
Great, thank you. So I hope that addresses the question. Another one that might have been addressed by a subsequent slide, but does the CDC access VAERS or use a separate database?
Yeah, they use the exact same data that we use.
Great. Okay, and another one, probably referring to slide 13. How are vaccine adverse events following immunization identified, characterized? And presumably the questioner is asking, how do you verify if it's a true reaction or just a coincidental event?
Yeah, this is Narayan. I can sort of chime in, and then David, please feel free to correct me or add on. But basically, we look at a number of factors. A spontaneous adverse event report in of itself, it's very difficult to assess causality. But we do look at sort of, is it biologically plausible, knowing what we know about the vaccine and the condition that the adverse event that's reported, is there biologic plausibility? We look at temporal association. Is the timing seem right? We can also evaluate other things. Is this something that we've seen before? One report in isolation is probably less convincing than if we've seen a clustering. If there's any data, particularly for vaccines that are multiple doses, like the Pfizer BioNTech and Moderna, if there's a challenge, re-challenge, again, that information is very compelling to let us know that yes, possibly there's a relation there. those are the main things we look at. And again, we have a team of medical officers, and we have a low threshold at times to sort of make sure that we're doing due diligence and evaluating these things closely. We also, I should mention, there's this large amount of information pre-marketing in the clinical trials, and so we look if there's any adverse events that were reported in the clinical trials. And of course, in that setting, we have the benefit of a control group and a placebo group, so we could sort of note if there were any imbalances. Yeah, I think that covers that issue.
Great, thank you. Next question, is the coding from Vares updated with Medra upversioning? So when a new version of Medra becomes available, do you upversion the old data or just start using the new version of Medra?
Yeah, so there is no going back retrospectively to the data. So yeah, so older reports are maintained with the older Medra codes, and from the point of the update, the newer codes are applied.
Great, thank you. And on personal comment, somebody who's been vaccinated, I've been impressed with VSafe after my vaccination. I hear from several people that they do not trust the vaccine due to it being given under the EUA, the Emergency Use Authorization, and not fully approved yet. How would you respond to these comments from people?
Yeah, so I guess I would say that the EUA process, I think there is perhaps some misinformation about it. When these vaccines, the consideration was for them to be authorized, there were a series of public meetings where the benefits and potential risks were discussed extensively, and the public was allowed to comment, and that data was shared widely and disseminated widely. So the process is very transparent, I would say, number one. Number two, with vaccines in particular, and with emergency use, there was this concern of they were developed so rapidly, but vaccines, as you know, take a long time to develop. But what they did with development, and this is, I'm not an expert, but basically they ramped it up very quickly. Those studies, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, were done very rapidly, sequentially. And that's not normally done in the private sector, many times for economic reasons. You finish the phase 1 and then you gather enough funding to do a phase 2, and sometimes a period of years can go by, and then phase 3. And then after phase 3 and success, you ramp up the manufacturing. With the emergency use authorization, all those studies, those components were completed, but they were done in rapid succession, and the economic risk in some cases was assumed by the U.S. government, so that expedited things greatly. So there's this appearance that maybe perhaps those steps were skipped or anything. That's not the case. Everything was done, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. It was done in rapid succession, and while that was occurring, manufacturing was ramped up as well, because again, with this critical situation, with hundreds of thousands of people dying of SARS-CoV-2, it was felt that this was necessary.
And in the interest of time, I'll just take a couple of other questions. How long does it take for an adverse event that is serious, like the J&J vaccine, the TTS, is accumulated before it is released to the general public as an issue or emergency? So communication of emerging safety signals, I guess.
I think it varies on the adverse event. And that's sort of why I showed the timeline for TTS. That was, 6 cases out of over 6 million doses. We shared that fairly soon after we had, information that we thought that this could be a potential issue. So there's not any, fixed timeline that we release it at a certain time span. But we are very cognizant, and we are very transparency is extremely important, that we do make people, and we've done several publications as well for a wide array of different safety issues. And CDC at that website updates sort of a number of different safety concerns, and they actually in some cases have a running tally of how many they've seen for different events such as anaphylaxis and so forth.
Great, thank you. And the last question, you mentioned about reviewing medical records. Were they for clinical trial cases or spontaneous cases?
I was referring to the spontaneous cases. Now, they do review medical records for clinical trials. That's not done by our division, but for the spontaneous cases, if it's serious or an adverse event of special interest, an attempt is made to get medical records. And once we have those, we do, if necessary, review, and we can, further kind of assess that safety issue based on laboratory results or whatever that medical record may contain.
Great. Well, thank you both, Narayan and David, for that excellent presentation. It's really reassuring to know that the robust surveillance system's in place. So thank you again for sharing that information with us, and I encourage everybody to go out and look at the information that's freely available to understand this better. Thank you. So I'll pass back to Hannah for our next presenter, which is Kate.
Thank you, Judy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well, thanks.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone, from here in the UK, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is just a brief overview of what I'll be covering in the session today. I'll talk a bit about the yellow card scheme, which is our spontaneous ADR reporting system in the UK. I'll talk a bit about how we've integrated with clinical systems to improve reporting, and then I'll pick up from where Judy's introduction left off, and I'll explain a bit about the Snomed to Medra map and how we use the map in the MHRA. If you go to the next slide, please. So first of all, to provide you with some background, at the MHRA, our adverse drug reaction reports are known as yellow cards, and they're collected through our spontaneous reporting system, the yellow card scheme. So we accept direct reports from patients, parents and carers, as well as healthcare professionals, and people can report to us through a variety of routes, including paper reporting forms, via email, via our dedicated yellow card phone line, through our website and through our mobile phone app, which is available on iOS and Android. We can also receive yellow card reports from healthcare professionals directly through integration of the yellow card reporting form into their clinical IT systems. And more recently, we have also created a coronavirus yellow card website, which is used specifically for reporting ADRs to the COVID vaccinations. Next slide, please. For the next few slides, I'm going to focus on the clinical system route that I just mentioned. So our yellow card reporting form is currently integrated into various primary and secondary care IT systems. In terms of primary care, the yellow card has been embedded in System 1 since 2010, in Vision since 2016, and more recently in EMIS since 2019. We also have the form integrated into the secondary care systems, MI Databank, Cerner, and Ulysses. And as you can see from the graph on this slide, reporting through clinical systems has increased over recent years as paper reporting has decreased. This data is a little out of date now, but as I'm sure you'll appreciate, patterns of reporting have been slightly skewed due to the pandemic. Next slide, please. Again, this graph further demonstrates the changes in reporting routes over recent years, focusing more closely on two of our most common healthcare professional reporters, GPs and hospital pharmacists. And again, showing the paper reports shown in orange are decreasing, and clinical system reporting shown in blue here is increasing. Next slide, please. So integration of the yellow card into clinical systems has real benefits for the healthcare professionals. It's very accessible, so anyone with an internet connection can report to us. It's far easier to report, as the majority of the data required for a valid report is taken directly from the patient's electronic health record, meaning that it takes less time for the healthcare professional to find and fill in these details manually. Integration with the system also means that we're able to quickly follow up with the healthcare professional reporter if there is further information that would aid our assessment of the cases. Next slide, please. There are also real benefits for us at the MHRA, as the report is directly integrated with our case processing system, Sentinel, in contrast to paper reports, which each have to be manually scanned and uploaded to our system. The process is far more automated, as the fields in the integrated yellow card report directly correspond to those in our system. So this reduces the chance of data processing errors and increases the quality of our data. Integrated reporting is more cost effective and more eco-friendly. And again, we have that direct contact with the healthcare professionals, so we're able to provide them with promotional material and information that may be relevant to them. Next slide, please. To give a bit more background in terms of the clinical systems that the yellow card is currently integrated with, as I said before, the yellow card has been integrated with System 1 since 2010, and this is a system that's currently used in approximately 20% of GP practices across the UK. And since 2016, the yellow card has also been embedded into Vision. I've included some stats on the slides for you, but just to highlight a couple. So in 2019, 93% of all of our GP reports were received electronically, and 76% of those reports were received directly through clinical system integration. So these reports really do make up a large portion of the cases that we receive. Next slide, please. In terms of secondary care systems, we're integrated into the Cerner programme, and use of this system continues to expand. We've also collaborated with the MI Databank system, which is used in over 50 hospitals in the UK by medicines information pharmacists. Next slide, please. Most recently, following a successful pilot, the yellow card is also now embedded into the EMIS system, with 60 practices being early adopters in 2019, and we're continuing to roll out into further sites. This is an important milestone for the MHRA, as with EMIS integration, we now have the yellow card embedded into 93% of all of the GP practices systems across the UK. Next slide, please. So to bring this back to the main topic of the Snomed and Medra maps, the integration of our reporting form into clinical systems is really important to the MHRA, and a huge amount of work has gone into partnering with these systems to increase the automation of our processes. But there was still a limiting step in this process, as the healthcare professional systems use Snomed terminology, and at the MHRA we use Medra. So when we were receiving cases from clinical systems, the vast majority of clinical information was not populating automatically within our structured fields, as the two terminologies couldn't be translated. And this required a very manual process to get that clinical information into our structured fields. And I'll describe that process in the coming slides. So we at the MHRA were very keen to work with Snomed International and with the MSSO to help develop these maps that would allow the two terminologies to interact and to make our case processing more efficient. So as you heard from Judy's presentation, there are two maps which have been created, and these were developed using a subset of the most commonly used Medra terms. There's one map that translates Snomed to Medra and one that translates Medra to Snomed. And as we use Medra in the MHRA, we utilise the Snomed to Medra map. Next slide, please. So over the next few slides, I'll use the MHRA as a bit of a case study to demonstrate how we use the Snomed to Medra map. When we receive an electronic report from clinical systems, the clinical information can be present in the ADR section of our case folder. It can be within the medical history or within the lab tests. And as I said, prior to the introduction of the Snomed and Medra map, this clinical information would sit in the free text fields of our cases and not within the structured fields, therefore requiring manual classification before the case could be entered onto our system for signal detection. Next slide, please. So prior to the development of the maps, this is what our past medical history screen might look like when we received a case from a clinical system. So each of these long number codes within the free text field are Snomed codes, and each of these represents a clinical term. If you go to the next slide, please. So in order to get each of those terms captured within our structured fields in our case folders, we had to manually copy the Snomed code and paste it into the Snomed browser to search for the corresponding term. So in this example, the code that I've searched for represents the Snomed term hemorrhage of muscle. If you go to the next slide, please. We then have to search for that Snomed term within the Medra browser and select the most appropriate term, bearing in mind that there may be multiple terms to choose from. The term that's then deemed the most appropriate by the assessor is then entered into our structured fields within the ADR case folder, and that process then has to be repeated for each of those Snomed codes that appear in the free text field. Next slide, please. So on the left is an example of the free text medical history field when the case is received, and then on the right is once each of those terms has been manually captured into the structured fields. And as I'm sure you can imagine, that takes a long time for each case, and then our assessors are processing anything between 20 to 30 cases every day. Next slide, please. So here I've just included a screenshot so you can see what the Snomed to Medra map actually looks like. As Judy mentioned, it's essentially just an Excel spreadsheet that includes the Snomed code and Snomed term, and then the corresponding Medra code and Medra term. And we then import that map into our system, and that allows automatic mapping of the terms into the structured fields. Next slide, please. So following the introduction of the map into our system, the need for that manual process of taking each of the Snomed codes and finding a suitable Medra term to capture is now removed for the majority of terms, and the corresponding Medra terms are automatically populated within our structured fields of the ADR case folders. However, there are still some terms that remain unmappable, and that's because of the different scopes of the two terminologies. So, for example, the Snomed term non-ischemic congestive cardiomyopathy doesn't have an exact match in Medra. The term non-ischemic cardiomyopathy does exist in Medra, but the two terms don't link to one another in the maps, as this would lose the congestive concept being reported. So in cases like this, the term would still require manual classification by the assessor. Next slide, please. So using the maps has had real benefits for us at the MHRA. Firstly, it's reduced inconsistencies. So prior to the mapping, different assessors may have reached different coding conclusions, but by using the map, it reduces this subjective element of coding. It's also improved our data, as we're not having to change the medical or clinical input of the healthcare professional. And finally, and probably most importantly to our assessors, the map has streamlined our processes hugely, as we're no longer having to go through that step-by-step process that I've just demonstrated. So our assessors are saving minutes on every case, and when you add that up, it really does save a significant amount of time. If you go into the final slide, please. So in terms of next steps for us at the MHRA, we'll continue to use the Snomed to Medra map in our live environment, and with time we'll be able to feed back any further insights that we've gained from our experience to Snomed International and to the MSSO. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you everyone for listening. If you do have any questions, I'll do my best to answer those today, but please do make use of the yellow card mailbox as well if questions come to you after this session. And as Judy mentioned earlier, there's a number of useful resources on the MSSO website, so do make use of those as well. Thank you. I'll hand back to Judy.
Thank you so much, Kate. It was a terrific presentation, really gratifying to see the practical application of the maps that we developed and see the benefits in terms of consistency and time saving. Just wondering if in your initial use of the maps, if you identified any areas that are represented in Snomed commonly in electronic health records for adverse events in particular that are not presently included in the maps, and do you foresee putting in requests to add those concepts?
I know that a number of terms that come through from the clinical systems may be information that we're not actually looking to include in our case folders. So for example, information about consultations with patients, for example, and our implementing the map has helped us to eliminate that information from our cases and reduce the need to have to go and manually remove that information from our cases. In terms of any initial thoughts of additions to the map, I'm not aware of any at the moment. I'm sure with more use we'll pick up on some.
Great. I have another question. What is the volume of AE reporting coming from the clinical systems?
I don't know off the top of my head, but as I said in the slides, the reporting from GPs I think is up around 76%. So it's really quite high.
That is high for spontaneous reporting, yes. Great. And I can see a comment from somebody who was actually part of the mapping work, so give that person credit. Thanks for the excellent presentation. It's good to see that the work is put to good use. So it's a big team that developed the maps. The MSSO, Snomed International, MHRA, a number of industry and other regulatory contributors. So a really big team effort. Let's see. Does the yellow card solicited events match the FDA Vares adverse events of special interest. Is there any correspondence? Or are you sharing the data with Vares in any way?
I'm not sure of the answer to that one. I'm sorry, I can't see who posted that question. If you wanted to send that in an email over to the yellow card mailbox, we'll be able to respond with a direct answer. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that one.
Okay, great, thanks. And I think this question has already been answered. Does MHRA contemplate requesting additional terms to be mapped? I think we'll see how that evolves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. That's it. Wonderful. Well, we've gained 10 minutes or so for the next presentation. So thank you again, Kate, and please stick around for the open Q&A at the end.
Thank you.
I'll hand back to Hannah for Hank and Lee.
Okay, Hank, you should be able to share your screen. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, awesome. Well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining today. We're going to talk today about Medra upversioning, a very important topic. Okay. So on the agenda for today, three basic topics. The decision to upversion, how you get to that decision, the upversioning of your search strategies that are associated with the data, and then how do we do it at CGen? By the way, MVAT is our friend. We'll tell you more about that later. And so to upversion or not upversion, as Shakespeare once said, that is the true question. Why would we want to upversion? When you look at the data in your trials, you have data being reported in 2021 terms. So, it doesn't make sense from a accuracy and consistency standpoint to have a Medra dictionary in an older version, like 17.0, 21.0. You want the newest version. And the reason being is that, one, it makes the, from a selfish perspective as a coder, it makes the coding easier because you're in the newest dictionary, you're able to find a more robust list of lower level terms to match up a verbatim against. And when you have a more specific LLT match to the verbatim, that provides more fruitful analysis usually. The second reason of why we would want to upversion is it's a recommendation from many of the regulatory authorities. So the FDA has the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide and the Data Standards Catalog. The latest versions are on the FDA website. So, I'm calling out the sections that state that, the FDA understands that when you are submitting a BLA, NDA, and not necessarily pooling for a analysis, you're going to have studies across that submission in various versions. They just recommend that when a study starts, that you start in the newest version of Medra. However, that entirely goes out the window when you start pooling. So if you start pooling for analyses, like with integrated safety summaries or ISSs, then it is recommended that you are in a single version, and the single version being the most current version. So that when you upversion your studies to be in the most current version, that makes it easier on you when you have to submit for pooled analyses purposes. Okay, so we covered the pros. Now we gotta be the devil's advocate and cover the cons. Why wouldn't we want to upversion? This all comes down to a variety of factors. So, what type of methodology is your organization going to choose if you were looking to upversion? And the MSSO has a wonderful table in section 4.1 of the Medra term selection points to consider, and I pasted it in here, where you can see the 4 different methods. And notice how when we progress from method 1 to method 4, how the accuracy of the data is more accurate and hopefully more consistent. Great for analysis purposes, great for patients. However, puts a huge strain on an organization because you need personnel and you need time. So that's another thing, we mentioned about the personnel resources and the time. Also with coding systems, there's a variety of different coding systems out there. And each organization has their respective challenges or limitations. There is no perfect coding system, so each system will have its limitations or challenges that you have to recognize and hopefully can address and maybe have workarounds for. The other reason not to up version is you have to consider that when you put data into the newest Medra version, you also need to look at all your Medra search strategies. You cannot have data in Medra 24.0 and be using Medra SMQs or custom Medra queries in Medra 23.0. And I'm going to tell you why. Our good friend, the data retrieval and presentation points to consider section 2.6 calls out that terms that are used to construct queries or search strategies should be in the same Medra version as the data being queried. So that means if you have data that you just up versioned, you need to go back within your organization and look at your search strategies. So good news. It's not, I don't want to be a fatalist. There is a silver lining to this cloud. The good news is the MSSO has taken half the work away from us. They are versioning the SMQs, so they maintain the SMQs. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't look at them. You should still see what the SMQ is in your current situation, look at the SMQ in the new situation, and still assess whether the SMQ offers the value to your specific analysis. And then the same thing with the custom Medra queries or the CMQs. The unfortunate thing is that each organization will have to go back and look at their CMQs, notice whether there are changes between one version to another, and see what type of changes need to be made revisions-wise to your search strategies. So we're going to talk more about that shortly. Like now. So each organization should have specific processes in place to manage the versioning of your custom Medra queries. So at CGEN, we have a global safety risk management team that does the managing of the versioning of our custom Medra queries, but they get assistance from our clinical data coding team. And at CGEN, we have a form that captures the defined structure for each CMQ. So if we do a CMQ, if we take the peripheral neuropathy SMQ, for example, and we modify it, we need to fill out a form that says what that CMQ is going to be called, what is its defined structure, inclusion, exclusion criteria, what terms to use, what terms not to use. And the reason for this is, God forbid, I get hit by a bus or leadership changes. We need to have something in place that someone new comes in and says, I can recreate that search strategy from scratch. So the clinical data coding team or our global safety team, we generate the global impact report from Mvat. So, if we were looking from 23.0 to 24.0, we would run the global Mvat impact report from the Medra version analysis tool, for those who don't know what Mvat is. And we would look to see what the changes are and how those changes may affect the current version of our CMQ. So that definitely means that I have to pull in all the medical minds, all the biostatistical minds involved with the analysis of the signals. So prior to upversioning CMQ, our global safety team meets with the respective medical monitors to ensure that a search strategy is still sufficient to meet the business needs. Because, as we look at a CMQ, that CMQ may not have been affected by the up version from 23.0 to 24.0. So then that means no work on our end because we don't need any new PTs. None of these PTs have been demoted. Things haven't changed. So, you know, that is some good news there. After reviewing the changes from the Global Impact MVAT report, the team decides whether revisions are needed to the CMQ. If they are needed, then once again, we have forms. Everything needs to be appropriately documented in case the hit by bus scenario or new personnel coming in. We always should document what we're doing so you can go back to it. The clinical data coder or the global safety team can then retrieve any new terms and put together the list of preferred terms. We usually throw it into an Excel spreadsheet with the codes. And that is our custom Medra query that can then be called out against the data sets as needed for signal analysis. So how do we do the actual upversion process here at Seagen? Like I said, I'm going to continue saying it. The Medra version analysis tool is your friend. And it's definitely my friend. It will get you out of hours of work. It's very efficient, and I'll show you how a little later. So we upversion on the clinical side at different frequencies from the global safety team. With most companies, if not all companies, the global safety teams at companies need to be in the most current version. So our global safety team upversions every 6 months, and they follow the timelines for implementation recommended by the points to consider, meaning that the March 1st release becomes the reporting version the first Monday of May. The September 1st release becomes the reporting version the first Monday of November. So we only upversion in the clinical database with the major releases that on the March 1st releases. So we do that across all of our active studies. We do allow our project teams, our study teams, an out. They have to provide a written rationale of why they don't want to upversion. So, you know, that's extra work to a study team. So, you know, most of the time they can't come up with a strong rationale, which means 99.9% of the time we're upversioning their study. The clinical data coding team will then start the process of upversioning all our active studies within the clinical database realm. There's a process that we go about doing as soon as the new dictionary versions have been loaded onto our Seagen coding segment. So the good news is that our coding vendor needs approximately 10 to 15 business days to load the Medra files, validate that that Medra dictionary file load was accurate, and then make those new dictionary versions available in the dictionary repository for the coding administrator to choose on the Seagen coding segment. So prior to upversioning, it's always a good idea to identify the potential changes between the Medra versions. So, you know, we use MVAT to generate 2 reports. Now, I've seen at some organizations that they only provide the impact to the study data, and that's dangerous process to follow. If you only give your project team a data impact report, which is changes to the specific study data, but you fail to provide them the global changes between the 2 versions, which the global impact report is not inclusive of any specific study data, you pose a potential risk for missing safety signal identification because the team may not be aware of stuff, and I will clarify that in a minute. So we run both the global and data impact reports, and we send them to the study data manager, the medical monitor, and biostatistician for their review, and then we let them see if there's any questions. They need to understand the specific impact to the study data coding, along with taking a look at the global impact, because both the data impact and the global impact can dictate how the respective Medra search strategies, whether they're SMQs or CMQs, may be affected. Because you got to remember, changes in PTs or SOCs can affect various search strategies. So you got to keep that global picture in mind. So here's the good news about our coding vendor delaying us 15 business days. When we have this 15 business day delay, what a perfect time to take all of our active studies and generate all the global impact reports and all the data impact reports. Because from March 1st to March 10th and September 1st to September 10th, that's approximately how long it takes us to generate all these, send them out to the respective study teams. We generally give the respective study teams 1 to 2 weeks. Basically the amount of time until the dictionary versions are available on our coding segment. We want them to review and ask any questions they may have. We do know that some coding systems out there have a impact analysis functionality built into their systems, especially not a lot of the newer coding, standalone coding systems that are out there, or some of the integrated coding systems. I always want to advocate, though, for the MSSO's MVAT, because what I have seen benchmarking against a lot of these new tools is that they benchmark against the MVAT. So, you know, when you are working in coding tool X and it has its Medra version analysis report, more than likely 99% that they used the MVAT to benchmark against, because the MVAT is the gold standard in the industry, because the MSSO is our gold standard maintenance organization. So, you know, rather than use the version analysis reports within our given coding system, we would rather use the MVAT reports. So a big, kudos out to the MVAT. And that's also because the MVAT report is, in my opinion, this is my opinion, more user-friendly and easier to interpret. There are some systems out there that have gotten on board and mirrored the MVAT format, output format. So they may look very similar to MVAT, but some of the systems I've seen, the output of the version analysis reports are horrific and almost impossible to detail to your project teams. Okay. So after the project teams have had time to review the impact reports, then the real fun begins. We put on our Medra upversion hats and hit the ground running. So you should be following your organization's specific procedures along with your coding systems procedures for the upversioning process. After that upversion process is run, remember we talked about methodology. So how much QC review are you going to do after the upversion's been run? Are you going to do no QC? I have seen companies do that. Very dangerous to the quality and consistency of the data. Or do you do a random QC? Do you do 100% of everything? Do you do 100% of where it's a not a direct lexical match to the verbatim? So at CGen, we take the approach of reviewing anything that is not a direct lexical match to the verbatim, knowing that certain pain points or certain problematic terms like pain, neuropathy, mucositis that are medically problematic to us as an oncology company, we're going to catch those on the data review end. We don't care about seeing those on the Medra upversioning end, so we're not going to worry about them. What we worry about are things that are not a direct lexical match to the verbatim at the LLT level. And the reason we do 100%, it comes down to the upversion workflow behind the scenes. So many coding systems out there are very rigid in their workflow process. Some of the newer systems allow you to customize, which is good, but some of them do not. So our current system does not allow the upversion workflow to be customized, which means it takes the current coding, so the current LLTs, runs that against the CGen synonym list, and then against the dictionary, and then if nothing meets those two criteria, then it drops off to be manually coded. And of course, behind the scenes, there's a medically intelligent algorithm behind the scenes with almost every coding system. So while this type of workflow may seem optimal, because my God, we all spend a lot of time maintaining these Medra synonym lists. Some companies do global lists, some have project specific, some do study specific. But we spend a lot of time as administrators on those lists, trying to keep them clean. So you want to use them. Problem though, if you use something that's been coded and assigned as a synonym, and you were in an old dictionary, so you may not have had the best term to choose from in that old dictionary. And what happens is you end up going to a less specific LLT or an umbrella term. So a good example would be some new cardiac. Medicine is constantly evolving. Just like the whole COVID scene. Medicine is constantly evolving. New conditions are found out and identified yearly. And of course, these all get added into Medra via the change request or proactivity requests. But at the time you're coding, you could be in Medra 17.0, you could be in Medra 23.0, so something a little newer, but not super new. And you don't have the ability to grab that specific LLT. You have to code to an umbrella term. Now, notice, when you upversion, it's not upversioning the verbatim, it's upversioning cardiac disorder. You don't want that. You want it running against the verbatim, because the verbatim may be a direct match in the dictionary. So, that's something to think about for those of you that can customize your workflows. So, we do not have that ability to customize the workflow. So, because of that, we notice a lot on our post upversion QC terms that need to be recoded to better LLT matches. So, after all the recoding is completed, we notify our project team that the study has been successfully upversioned to that new version of Medra. And then we always in the email to the project team, give a screenshot. Pictures are worth 10,000 words, people. So if you show them that you're in Medra 24.0 and they see it, then it's more trust instilled. Yeah. So now we get to take the keys to the Ferrari for a ride. So we're going to take Mvat for a spin. So I have the link to Mvat here. For those who do not know, it is in the tools section or drop-down menu of the Medra website. I also gave you the link. Okay, and when you come in, you default to the login screen. So you choose your language, enter your organization's Medra ID, and then your organization's password. And then at your home screen, notice the choices over here. Your Mvat home defaults to the global impact report. And the reason I say that is I'm going to show you the data impact report. Notice the data impact report has a bunch more tabs. That's how you know you're on the data impact report, because it's allowing you to import data. So remember, the default login screen is the global. So you want to choose your language. And since we upversion every year, I want to show you 23.0 to 24.0. If you're interested in only certain select system organ classes, you can highlight multiple ones there or clear the selection. You can also include secondary SOC information. It's been my experience, you want to be very careful doing that. A lot of people who receive these outputs are very confused by the secondary SOC information. So if you include it, you need to specifically tell your project team that it is included, because it will be confusing to them to see it and not understand if they don't understand Medra. So at CGen, we do not include the secondary SOC information because my team does not wish to see it. So we run the report, and depending on what your starting version is and your ending version is, it may take a little bit of time. So if you're going from 17.0 to 24.0, go grab a cup of coffee and come back. It'll take a little while, but not nearly as that bad. So notice what you selected. This is all correct. You have a summary and details. So you have a choice right now to go to each one and click to review that detail. You also have the choice not to export this by unclicking it. But we're going to keep everything in there and export it to the spreadsheet. Okay, and notice all the different sections are in respective tabs. And if you or your team members are confused over what each section is, this is a godsend right here. Your savior. It will tell you exactly what each section is all about. So then what I end up doing is I end up saving this. To a specific name. So I'll call it MVAT Global Impact Report, Medra, old version to new version. And that is ultra specific on what the name of the file is. Nope, I don't want to go back to. So that is the Global Impact Report. So we got that one not done. Now we got to do the study data. So you click on Data Impact Report. Okay. What language are you going to be in? What is the version of the data that you're taking in, that you're ingesting? So it's 23.0. What is the end version that you're looking at for the impact? And then also whether you want to include secondary SOC information. Once again, my prior advisement is if you include that, please advise the team that it is in there. So you click next. Very important that you have a MVAT template. So because we do so many of these, we actually created an Excel file called Mvat Template, which is just the LLTs copied over from your study coded data. It says row ID is optional. I highly, highly recommend adding it, because if you don't add it, it will make your life a living nightmare trying to find if there are any, if God forbid you have any errors in your file, trying to go back and find them, especially if it's a larger file. Some of these larger pharma CRO companies are uploading thousands and thousands of terms. Highly recommended using a row ID. So yeah, I have some sample data here. So you want to choose the file. Click next. And one thing you want to be aware of is know how many rows are, how many observations are in your data that you're uploading. So we had 10 rows. We went from Medra 23 to 24, and we didn't include secondary SOC information. We uploaded 10 rows, thank heavens. It processed all 10, thank heavens, no errors. And I just happened to pick 10 terms that were all affected. That doesn't always happen. So in general, across most of our oncology studies, we range on the data impacts between 10% to some of our studies could be 35 to 40% impacted. Very rarely are we at this high of a number. Summary and details. Just like before, we can go to each individual section. We can unclick to not add it into the export. We're going to actually export everything out. And you'll notice that as it's opening, that the format looks pretty familiar. Looks somewhat familiar to our global impact, only minus a few categories for obvious reasons, because this is not global, this is inclusive of study data. So once again, if the team has any questions, you give them the hover text. You tell them to hover over. Oh, and it's, sorry, if I show it full screen, there we go, all the tabs below. And then normally what I do then is I save this. And I call it study, whatever the study, data impact report, Medra old to new. That is very clear on, so when you're sending these two impact report files, they know exactly what each file is. They got the global, and then they got study XYZ's data impact report. So as you're sending that, they know exactly what they have. So that is how we use MVAT. So in conclusion, whether to upversion or not is a decision that every organization has to make. One thing I forgot to throw in there is if you're working at a CRO, you're in a unique situation because you're advocating on behalf of your coding team to probably upversion to make it easier on whether you're doing the analysis and the coding. However, you are also part of the budget of your sponsor. So sponsor budgets will often dictate, because the CROs do charge for upversions, whether it's rolled in per the term or it's charged separately. So that's one thing I forgot to throw out there is the budget constraints often dictate whether upversions are done or not. And then if you're going to upversion, what methodology are you going to follow? With the level of post-upversioning QC. When you upversion, always make sure to review all your Medra search strategies, SMQs and CMQs, to make sure that they're matching against the data they're searching against. Make sure you send the project teams the global impact and data impact reports and answer any questions. Once all the questions have been answered, then you get into the trenches and actually do the actual upversioning following your organization's operating procedures and your coding system procedures. Once the upversion's done, are you going to do any post upversion QC review? If so, how much? And do any recoding after that's done, and notify the team after all recoding's done that you're in the new version. And as I had mentioned before, screenshots are worth 10,000 words. So if you can give them a screenshot showing the new dictionary version, it's always good to show that to them. And that's all I had. Any questions at all? I can answer questions now, or I can answer them later, and I provided my contact information below.
Great, thank you so much, Hank, for that very comprehensive tour through the benefits of MVAT. So it's good to know the MSSO tools have real-world practical applications, and they're nimble and easy to use. We don't really have any questions per se, but rather some observations. But I just note that somebody said when you're considering using systems and your management team are buying new products, make sure that you have the ability certainly to store and thoroughly document SMQs and CMQs as well, which may be more critical. An interesting application for MVAT, rather than uploading already coded Medra terms and seeing if there are any changes in a new version of Medra, is to upload instead verbatims that might be on a synonym list, for example, and effectively use MVAT to see if those are now valid new Medra LLTs or PTs in a new version. And I could say to you also that coming in the next update of the web-based browser and MVAT, they will be integrated into one single system rather than have to go to two different applications, because many of the functionalities overlap. And one of the requirements that we will be implementing in that new release is the ability precisely to do that, is to upload a set of verbatim terms in the web-based browser component and see if there are any direct matches. So effectively, it's a simple auto-encoding tool just for direct matches. So that might help you with looking at your synonym list to see if any synonyms need to be removed from that list, because you now actually have a valid Medra term. Okay, I'm going to hold the last question, I think, just so that we can give Lee a chance. It's coming up on 3 a.m. in China, so we do appreciate her dedication to participating in this webinar. We'll transition over to Lee, and we will take the remaining questions at the end if we have some time. So over to you, Lee. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes,
Indeed,
you sound
loud
great.
and clear. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, and so hello everyone, I'm Li Zhang from Roche Product Development Safety Team. So I'm happy to be here to share with you some of our experiences in our daily work regarding using Mvat. So Hank just introduced the Medra up versioning and the Mvat used from a coding team perspective. So I'm going to share with you some of the Mvat application through a safety perspective. So I hope at the end of my talk, you will know better about Mvat and willing to use it in your daily work. So my talk will be in 4 parts. So in the first part, so is what group at Roche are using Mvat. Then in the second part, I will introduce the application of Mvat in our work from perspective of day-to-day work and during the Medra up versioning. And then finally, I will go on to briefly describe what other internal tool we have at Roche in place of Mvat. So let's move to the first part of my presentation, which is about what group at Roche use Mvat. So actually, I was surprised that Roche are the highest global user of Mvat. So after communicating with our coding team, we confirmed that safety team is the most frequent user for Mvat tool in Roche. So here comes to the question, so why does safety team pay so much attention to the Medra version updates and the comparison between the versions? I think the reason coincides with the reason why Medra is consistently updating. So first, use the new version to summarize the data from different sources that have used the old version. For example, for safety data, the more the better. So sometimes we need to pull in data from different clinical trials for analysis. And also, the safety team needs to take care of the post-marketing safety summary. So for example, like some periodic safety report. And secondly, regulatory health authority may require or prefer using the recent version of Medra. So this is easy to understand. And the third, stay current with the developed partner and the contract research organization. So sometimes there's a collaboration between organizations, and using the latest version of Medra is easy. The use of the preferred term is also stipulated in the reference safety information, RSI. And so which is a requirement of the reporting purpose from the health authority. And I will explain it to you later in details. And the cumulative RSI information is recorded by the expected term list ETL, which is the downstream of the RSI. So going into a little bit details. So regarding the RSI and ETL, in fact, the concept of the RSI was proposed by MHRA, and RSI is a document that contains a list of all the adverse reactions observed during our clinical trial. So the document details in seriousness of adverse reaction along with the description of their nature and the frequency. So the term can be added into the RSI. It must meeting certain criteria. I will go details for that. And if there are any clinical trials conducted in the UK or the EU country, this RSI is required for reporting purpose compliant with the regulations. So the RSI in the clinical trials should be located in the investigator brochure, and it uses for assessment. So in one hand, it's used for assessment of the expectedness of all suspected serious adverse reactions that occurred in the clinical trials. And in other hand, the SADR that assessed as expected for the expedient reporting won't generate any suspected, unexpected serious adverse reactions. Yeah, that's for SUSAR reporting. So, for example, if the term pneumonia has already been in the RSI, that means the pneumonia is considered expected. So it does not need to be reported as a SUSAR if the serious drug-related pneumonia occurred in clinical trial, except the life-threatening and fatal outcomes. And the CTFG recommends that the RSI or the SADR table looks like this. So there are 5 columns. If we look at the second column here, only expected SADRs are listed here, means these PT terms meet certain criteria. So, and most relevant to our today's talk, the present by SOC and PT, which must be under the current Medra versions. And the third column here shows the frequency of the events, and those numbers are calculated on aggregated level and based on the selected clinical trials. Next, I'm going to talk about the expected term list, the ETL. So this is the downstream element for the RSI. It is an Excel document file, so it contains the expected SADR list here. And here I only show the SADR table here. Actually, in this document, we also contain some regulatory information, like for the what time the IB has been effectiveness. So, so here this expect term list is used in generation of the summary table of the SADR for the periodic safety report like DSUR, and for the individual case safety report ICSR. For the need as the reference for the expected assessment. So an ETL must be created for all products where there's an IB maintained, including the not only for the approved product, not only for the unapproved product, but also for the approved product. So there are at least 3 times update per year. So 1 time for the IB update and the other 2 times for the Medra up versioning. So here I just want to emphasize again. So here only the preferred term can be listed here, not LLT and not medical concept, as you can see the columns here. Here comes to our the first Medra application. So when the safety team updates the reference safety information RSI in the IB once per year, so we need to verify whether the newly added term is the PT under the current version of Medra. So here I just want to show an example here. So like anemia is a new term that we would like to add in the new version of the IB. So we check whether the term is under the version of the current version of the PT in the Mvat system, like Han just showed. So here is the home page, and we search the code anemia and find out the anemia with such a spelling belongs to. Oops. What was happening? Oh, I'm sorry. Oops. So we find that the anemia with such kind of spelling belongs to LLT rather than PT. Then in the ICADR table, the anemia of the PT spelling like this should be added into the ICADR, but not the anemia spelling for the LLT. So maybe you're wondering whether this check function can be done in the Medra browser. The answer is yes, actually. So yeah, indeed, we can use the Medra browser to check. But one of the great advantage by using the Mvat is we can do the retrospective checks. So since the maintenance of the RSI is still manually operated at present, so the human error cannot be 100% avoided. So when we find there was a wrong term or any errors in the previously IB update, we need to use Mvat to see which version of the term was changed and was wrong to determine the impact of the safety reporting. So, and of course, we use the Mvat most often after the Medra versioning twice a year. So Medra update will have the impact on the ETL and also on the Roche-defined adverse group list. So we also call it Medra basket or the CMQ. And Medra is utilized for the biannual ETL Medra update process to identify the impact preferred term of the expected term list in the Medra version update. So all the PT from the ETL manually updated to generate the automated impact report to identify the update of the PT. Here's an example. We can see here we just want to compare the version, Medra version 23.1 to 24. So we use the function of the impact date. And here we upload the Excel sheet like this because it needs a certain format of this. And we just run the report so we can see there are a lot of changes, but what we are focused on will be the demotions and the Medra term names change. Here we can see the report. It's like the pulmonary mycosis has become to LLT, and the new corresponding PT is pulmonary, is the pulmonary pneumonia fungi. So here we have to change the SADR table accordingly. So you can see we change this term to the pneumonia fungi. So we do have like 200 molecular in Roche, and for each of the product corresponds an ETL document. So therefore, during the Medra update, we will compare these nearly 200 ETL documents with MVAT, just like the example I'm showing here. So another thing that will let us use MVAT after Medra update is the Roche-defined AE group terms, AEGT. And so the Medra baskets the PT grouping represent a specific medical concept. So, and the purpose for doing that is for further analysis if there is no suitable SMQ available. So we will say they are well defined and applicable to different medical scenarios with different drug product. So the creation is based on the existing SMQ by individual teams or as a combined effort by several teams. So the safety strategy leader is the owner of the Roche standard Medra basket. It also needs to be updated twice, maintained twice during the Medra upversioning. So the maintenance of the basket is actually very similar to the expected term list. We also upload the Excel sheet to the MVAT and then update the basket according to the report from the output. So we're not going to repeat the process here. So at the end, I will talk very briefly that Roche also has their own internal built-up system, which can list the Medra versioning changes for a study database. So it means we do not need to load the data into the MVAT as the study data has already received in our internal system. So there are two examples. One is the mega system is still under construction, and that is used for the RSI and ETL, and also in the for the coding team, they have their own clinical coding tool. So it lists the Medra version changes for study database as well. So, but in general speaking, so the automated comparison process of the MVAT is very convenient and accessible. So hence, we have not faced any problem while handling the defined process with that tool. So from a user point of view, I would recommend this tool. Also, if you're also using this tool, so we'll come to discuss together. So my email address is here. So I think that's all we have today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Lee, for that excellent presentation. It's a very nice complimentary talk compared to Hank's. So we do have some questions coming in now. If Hank can come back on the line as well. And let's see where we are for the first one. Okay, the first one would be for Hank. It's referring to the study impact report with the 10 LLTs. Can you show the example of the study impact report and how the 10 LLTs were recoded? So I can't recall whether there are any new non-current terms there that you would be forced to recode or any other changes to those 10 LLTs and whether you would recode them.
Yeah, we were yeah, it's for me or for, sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead, Lee.
Okay, so actually we recorded all of them in the expected term list. So that is like a cumulative information for all the version of the IB updates. So we have the PDS, so the product development safety log. So we record all the changes information there. So from which version and which term has been added and when the PT term has demoted to the LT, we record all the information there.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think maybe.
Did you want me to show my screen?
Yes, if you would, Hank, because I think it was specific to those 10 LTs that you showed. So how would you handle those? So just give a moment.
Show screen.
Should be able to grab it. So were there any currency changes or any other moves?
Here we go. Okay, there we go.
Perfect, yes. Okay.
So yeah, with those 10 terms, there were no, there were 2 terms, but when you go to the currency changes, none were affected.
None affecting your data?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So no non-current terms to recode there. Any other changes that you would make with respect to coding? For example, if an LLT had moved under a different PT and it had changed its concept as a result? Not really.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I always like to look at the promotions and the demotions just from a overall analysis perspective. The LLTs under different PTs is probably one of the most important from an analysis perspective, because now we know that no longer are these terms under this old PT, but it's now under the different, the newer PT.
Right.
And the tab that I think a lot of people have a ton of confusion over is the comprehensive LLT changes. Because what this dictates is that these are terms that are not necessarily inclusive of your study data that you uploaded, and a lot of people don't understand that, but it is related to the data that you uploaded. So it may be under the PT of the LLT that you uploaded. So what I do with this tab, this comprehensive LLT changes tab, is I tell the project team to look at this as it relates to your search strategies.
Right. It gives you everything, which is probably more than you need. My colleague Amanda Sanders recently did a couple of webinars specifically on Mvat and goes into the details of this report. So if you want that further information, I encourage you to look at those recorded webinars on our website. But it's probably one of the misunderstood functions of Mvat is giving you more than you actually asked for. Okay, great. Another question was, let's see, kind of a timing issue, maybe for Hank, I think. How do you deal with the data submitted or coded between the date that you pull the data for the impact analysis and the day that you actually do the upversioning? So there's a time window there.
That is a great question.
It's changing the goalposts, isn't it?
It is, and I don't think you can really do anything about that. It's all static. What you could do, I think it actually depends on the coding system. So for those who are in a coding system where they are ingesting data in a more infrequent time period, so Oracle TMS is a great example. Some organizations use Oracle where they're only ingesting data maybe weekly, and they're pulling in data weekly, and they send off what they have, and then the project team gets back to them within that week, and then they upversion within that week. If you are in a more synchronous system, Medidata is an example. You pull the data, but it's constantly changing. You really can't do anything. It's sort of like doing pulling data, data cuts for new drug applications or BLAs. The data is constantly changing, so you can only do what you can do at that time, and the regulatory authorities understand that.
Great, thank you. And question, I think, for Lee, because you referred to this, the requirement from many regulators for integrated safety summaries to use a current or reasonably recent version of Medra. How do you suggest managing integrated safety summaries with the legacy studies that used older Medra versions versus studies using the new Medra version? I presume you're dictated by the demands of the regulator, but wondered if you could expand on that a little bit. How do you decide what to pull or what old studies to leave out?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of the reasons. Normally, we would like to use the pivotal study data for the pooling, and also it depends on the indications and to see which study we would like. But normally it's from phase 2 and phase 3. and we're not using any past data, but pivotal data is the most important one.
Right, and you would upversion those for the purposes of pooling?
Yes, yes. Well, we always use the current, the latest version of the Medra.
Great, good. This is more of a technical question. How many terms or synonyms can be loaded into the next version for direct matches, that auto-encoding aspect that I talked about? Right now for Mvat and the web-based browser, the number of records that you can upload in this Excel spreadsheet is 100,000, which is still not enough for some people. But my colleague Brian O'Hare says that the new function will actually be driven by the Medra APIs. So while we will impose some limits, he anticipates that the limit will be much higher than the current 100,000 rows. So it should be enough to keep many people happy. Okay, and what feature would you like to see added to Mvat? We're right at the beginning of the development process and still thinking about requirements to improve this integrated web-based browser and Mvat tool. What would you like to see? If you can't think of it right now, will you please send a note to us at the Msso help desk, and we can follow up with you and consider whether those aspects can be integrated into the new functions. Question for Lee, does Roche have some programmatic support in doing all of these analyses in Mvat, or that needs to be done manually one by one?
Yeah, at present, we really did it manually and one by one. But the program, the automation system is under developing. We hope we can have it rather soon.
Great. And the last one, very topical for our first presentation, Bell's palsy was a good example having an impact for vaccine safety. It was previously an LLT under the broader PT of facial palsy, and it's now been promoted to a PT in version 24.0, because that's on many people's adverse events of special interest for the COVID-19 vaccines. So it's right there at the PT level. Any other questions coming in? I don't see any. Well, I thank you all for sticking with the presentations today. I think we've had a very full agenda, excellent presentations by our guest speakers, very topical, and really addressing how Medra can help in all of these disparate activities, not only Medra itself, but the applications of the tools. So we thank you for your interest and participation in the Medra community. Please communicate with us and the speakers via email. You can contact us at the Msso help desk, and look forward to future opportunities to interact with you, whether it's training webinars or user group meetings or other forums like this. So I hope you all stay safe and well and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks again to all the speakers, and especially Lee. I hope you get a good night's sleep. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.